If you imagine an ordinary moment at an intersection in New York City, and there's a pause because there's a street light, and some people are stopped and others are in motion. Some cars are stopped and others are in motion. If you were to put that in a film terms, in a freeze frame, and hold everything for a second, you would realize that there's a universe there of totally disparate intentions. Everybody going about his or her business in the silence of their own minds, with everybody else and the street and the time of day and the architecture and the quality of the light and the nature of the weather as kind of background or field for the individual consciousness and the drama it is making of itself at that moment. When you think about that, that's what happens in a city. And that somehow the city can embrace and accept and accommodate all that disparate intention at one and the same time, not only in that corner, but in thousands of corners.
On September 2nd, 1609, an English explorer hired by the Dutch to find a faster route to the riches of the Orient steered his 80-ton ship off the surging currents of the North Atlantic and into an immense sheltered bay. Sailing to the mouth of the mile-wide river that flowed into it from the north, he pushed 100 miles upstream, hoping it led to China. It didn't. But though he had failed to find the Northwest Passage, Henry Hudson had stumbled upon something even better. One of the biggest and best natural harbors in the world. A safe haven, one fellow explorer said, wherein 1,000 ships may ride in safety. Of all the early explorers, Hudson was the first to sense the immense potential of the remote and lonely harbor. Yet even he could never have foreseen the tremendous human forces it would one day unleash, nor that the great city that would rise there would be dedicated to a crucial experiment, one that would grow ever more urgent with each passing year. The exhilarating, often harrowing experiment to see whether all the peoples of the world could live together in a single place.
New York City was founded by the Dutch. The Dutch didn't give a damn about anything except making money. And the more money you made, the closer you were to God. And they would build some churches to thank him for his generously setting things up for them.
Unlike Boston or Philadelphia or many other places in the United States, New York was not founded by visionaries anxious to create a new place to practice their own version of religious freedom. The Dutch came to New York City and established a trading post there to make a buck or to make a guilder. And that acquisitiveness, that materialism, that search for the success has dominated New York and characterized New York ever since the white person first set foot on this land. And even today, there's an energy in New York, there's a bustle in New York. And that bustle has been there for more than 350 years.
Because of its shape, the narrowness, the way the neighborhoods are all pushed together, you're constantly being forced to, whether you want to or not, watch other people with wildly radical styles. That's what a New Yorker, in some way, commits to, that constant life of transition, the constant possibility of change.
You can come here and reinvent yourself, or you can be born here and reinvent yourself. And you can change yourself. And if you can change yourself, presumably in the process you are also changing the whole structure of the world that you operate in order to make your new fictive reality come alive.
It was always the place of greatest opportunity. It was not the West. The West was the place of greatest opportunity if you were going to be a rancher, but say you weren't.
You have people from all over the world. You have more languages spoken in New York City than any city in the world. You have every national group, racial group, religious group represented here. And what they're competing to do is to really create a better life for themselves.
New York is continuously throwing up new ideas and new people. This turns out to be the setting in which political democracy becomes possible as in no other. It is exactly that money-crazy, driving commercial culture that made political democracy seem perfectly sensible, perfectly normal, and indeed brought it into existence, such that a popular democracy was established for the first time, and men of the people governed.
One of the reasons that this place is endlessly in flux and it's endlessly recomposed is because it is, in fact, a capitalist city. It is a place where capitalism has been allowed to work itself out with the least kind of impediments, for good and for ill. The good is that it produces incredible, dazzling things, but the downside of it is that you get what you pay for.
When most Americans think of history, they don't think of New York. They think of Williamsburg or Philadelphia or Boston. And yet New York is really the most historic of American cities, and really in a number of ways. It's, first of all, older than all those other places. Started in 1624 by the Dutch. But it's also unusual in other ways. More has happened in New York than in Boston or Philadelphia, or certainly colonial Williamsburg. I mean, the litany of important events that took place on the tiny island of Manhattan would be far beyond really any other similarly sized plot in the United States. And thirdly, people don't realize it, is that New York is old as a big city. And by the end of the 19th century, New York was the fastest growing city in the world. So New York encountered historically many problems which we associate with cities long before places like Athens or Istanbul or Beijing or half a hundred other places that technically are older than New York.
New York is unlike any other place in the United States. We've tested everything first. We've tested immigration. We've tested unionization. We've tested industrialization. All the great experiments of American society have probably occurred here first. The rapid urban expansion, this experiment in multiracial, multicultural society came here first.
When New York was founded at the dawn of the modern age, London and Paris were already 1,500 years old. Rome and Beijing, 2,000. Jerusalem, 4,000. And yet, somehow, in the centuries to come, the tiny colony on the edge of the world would rise to become the greatest city on earth, the undisputed cultural and economic capital of the world, and the supreme laboratory of modern life.
The old saw that whatever happens in New York happens in the rest of the country 10 years later has certainly been true for the life of our country. If American society is going to succeed, it is going to have to find a way to do what New York has always done, which is to take incredibly disparate human elements, put them together, and find a way for them to tolerate each other. So the fate of New York is extremely important to the fate of the country.
New York is the finest harbor in the Atlantic Ocean. You start there. And just as harbor, but it's so much more, it's an entrance into North America.
New York cannot be understood aside from its geography. Indeed, no city could. But New York more so than almost any city in the world, because here you have what's really a natural location for a great city. It's probably one of the 3 greatest harbors in the world. And then what's key is at the very heart of New York is an island, Manhattan. So that the Indians, who were not in most places in the United States in the early 17th century, were on the island of Manhattan, because it was a natural location for a great city.
As soon as they saw the sails of Hudson's ship, the local inhabitants, who called themselves the Lenape, rowed out to meet them, trying to keep pace with the strange-looking vessel as it made its way across the bay. 28 canoes, full of men, women, and children, one of Hudson's officers reported, seeming very glad of our coming. 15 years later, in the spring of 1624, the first boatload of colonists arrived to establish a permanent presence in the harbor, spurred on by Hudson's glowing reports of a fur-trading paradise, and eager to beat out their arch-rivals, the English, to the spoils of the North American continent. It was a business proposition from the very start. From one end to the other, the new colony was owned and operated by a giant corporation called the Dutch West India Company, the Atlantic wing of a vast trading empire that stretched round the world.
The Dutch East India Company, from which the Dutch West India Company we would call today kind of a subsidiary corporation, was one of the most successful commercial enterprises in the history of the world. For 200 years, it returned average annual profit in excess of 10%. So when we talk about the Dutch East India Company, we're not talking about some cutesy little company. We're talking about a company that was more successful and more powerful than IBM in our own time. And they anchored their North American operations on the place they call New Amsterdam.
Most of the first Dutch colonists were not in fact Dutch, but French-speaking Belgian Huguenots. 110 men, women, and children in all, in 30 different families, cast-offs hoping to make a go of it in the New World. They quickly settled on the slender island at the head of the bay, which they called Mannahatta, after an old Indian word, thought by some to mean Island of Hills, and by others, place of general inebriation. At the southernmost tip, they cleared land and built simple bark cabins, a crude counting house, and a stone and earth fort. Then widened the old Indian trail that ran north from the makeshift village and named it Heerstraat, or Breedaway. It would become Broadway. Other settlements soon sprang up around the harbor, including the village of Breukelen, named for a town back in Holland, and up along the East River, a sprawling plantation owned by a Danish farmer named Jonas Bronk. It was soon known simply as the Bronx. In 1626, just 2 years after the colony was founded, a ship carrying the first 11 African slaves arrived from Angola. They were quickly put to work building the fort and clearing land for white farmers. That same year, the Director General, Peter Minuit, called together the leaders of all the local tribes and made them a fateful offer. They have bought the island Manhattas from the wild men, the company accountant later reported, for the value of 60 guilders. The Dutch had, in fact, paid much more than the $24 of legend, but still less than $600 for all 14,000 acres of Manhattan real estate. The Indians, who had lived on the island since the end of the Ice Age, thought the arrangement temporary.
What's at the beginning of the city is at the end of the city, it's a real estate deal. And if there's ever a kind of motif that runs through the history of the city, it's that. It's the real estate deal at the beginning of the very existence of the city.
New York was founded for no other reason than to make a buck. The Puritans came to New England in order to worship God as they saw fit. The Catholics came to Maryland, the Quakers to Pennsylvania. The Dutch came to Manhattan to get beaver skins. And so devoted were they to making a profit that they didn't get around to even building a church for 17 years. And ever since, however big the city has gotten, somewhere deep in its soul, it is always New Amsterdam, where modern capitalism was invented.
But there were problems from the start. Though thick bales of beaver, otter, muskrat, and mink were soon being shipped back to Holland 4 times a year, the remote and lonely colony, 4,000 miles from the mother country, struggled to take hold.
People in Holland are, in fact, not terribly interested in coming here. The promoters send back these tracts about the glories of this place. But, you know, the fact of the matter was that from a Dutch perspective, if you were in Amsterdam and you wanted to make your fortune out in the colonies, you went to the Spice Islands, you went to Brazil, you got into the African slave trade. Beavers was a distinctly second-rate operation. It was for second-rank merchants.
In the winter of 1643, the colony's troubles deepened when an incompetent director named Willem Kieft tried to tax the local Indians, then launched a brutal year-long war against them when they resisted. In February, a platoon of Dutch soldiers fell on 2 unsuspecting Lenape villages along the East River, butchered 80 men, women, and children in their sleep, then marched back to Fort Amsterdam with their heads on pikes. Before the year was out, hundreds of Native Americans and dozens of Dutch settlers had died in what was called the Year of the Blood. Less than 2 decades after being founded, the fledgling colony had begun to fall apart, its population dwindling, drunkenness on the rise, and morale at an all-time low.
The most interesting thing about the Dutch period in New York to me is how much it set the pattern for behavior in New York. I forget what the exact ratio is, but there was an absurd ratio of citizens to taverns. It was virtually that every 20 guys had their own tavern. And it remains a ratio that's probably pretty close to the way the city has remained throughout its history.
It's like Dodge City. I mean, every other building is a bar, it's a mud hole, the sinkhole, the fort is falling down, pigs are rooting in the foundations. We need to shake this place up. And what they do is they, like a global corporation that they were, you can sort of think of the West India Company as sort of like Exxon with guns, I mean, with its own naval fleet. They transferred a branch manager from Curaçao up to New York and said, we want you to whip this place into shape. And he did.
In the spring of 1647, New Amsterdam got a new director general, a 37-year-old ex-soldier and minister's son, who had lost his right leg to a cannonball during a naval battle in the West Indies. Iron-willed, short-tempered, and puritanical, Peter Stuyvesant had strict orders to clean the place up and make it pay. I shall govern you as a father his children, he told the stubborn and unruly citizens of New Amsterdam. And it was soon apparent he meant every word he said. Within weeks of his arrival, he had banned drinking on Sundays, outlawed knife fighting in public, and imposed stiff fines for missing church, speeding on Broadway, and fornicating with the Indians. It was the beginning of a long and stormy relationship between the Director General and his colonists. But though they bitterly resented Stuyvesant's high-handed style of rule, New Amsterdam began to take hold.
In an incredibly short space of time, he has slaves lay out the road up to Harlem, gets a wall built, has streets built, has the port fixed up, builds himself an extremely nice house, takes a large chunk of the slave population for himself. But in fact, makes this place into a functioning operation. The population increases. He establishes a base, an economic base, which is slaving. This is going to be a slave entrepot, and they're going to run slaves into here and then down to the Caribbean.
By 1653, In less than 5 years, Stuyvesant had managed to transform the disorderly backwater into a bustling town, with its own piers, canals, windmills, and schools, 300 row houses, a population of 3,000, and a 2,340-foot wall, stretching all the way from the East River to the Hudson, built to keep out hostile Indians and the English.
So many things about New York that we think of as being unusual or distinctive in the 20th century really have their origins hundreds of years in the past. One thinks of congestion. Every American, every person in the world really knows about New York and its unusual vertical shape and the crowded streets. But again, this goes back to the 17th century, really, when the little Dutch village was crowded down in Lower Manhattan and all the houses were flush up against each other. Or the heterogeneity of the population. Already in the 1640s, there were 18 different languages being spoken on the streets.
Though it offended Stuyvesant's keen sense of order, to ease the chronic labor shortage, he reluctantly agreed to let in almost anyone willing to work. Census takers soon reported hearing a chorus of languages on the streets of New Amsterdam, including French, English, German, Spanish, Polish, and Portuguese. By 1654, the Dutch had become a minority in their own colony, and Stuyvesant himself feared that New Amsterdam would soon become too diverse to rule.
If nothing is done to stop it, I fear this colony will soon become a babel of confusion. We have here Papists, Mennonites, and Lutherans among the Dutch. Also many Puritans or Independents, and many atheists who conceal themselves under the name of Christians. It would create a still greater confusion if the obstinate and immovable Jews came to settle here.
But they soon did. In 1654, 23 Sephardic Jews sailed into the harbor, seeking refuge from the Spanish Inquisition in Brazil. Stuyvesant immediately petitioned the board of directors of the Dutch West India Company to have them turned away, insisting, he said, that none of the Jewish nation be permitted to infest New Netherland. To his astonishment, the petition was overturned. Chiding him for his bigotry, the directors reminded Stuyvesant that he was running a business colony, not a religious establishment, and that for the sake of that business, no one should be turned away.
The consciences of men ought to be free and unshackled, so long as they continue moderate, peaceable, inoffensive, and not hostile to government. Such have been the maxims of toleration by which this city has been governed. And the result has been that the oppressed and persecuted from every country have found among us an asylum from distress. Follow in the same steps, and you shall be blessed.
On September 12, 1654, the first Rosh Hashanah service in North America was held in private in New Amsterdam. It was the beginning of Congregation Sheareth Israel, the oldest existing Jewish congregation in the New World. It was also the beginning of the separation of church and state in America. In the centuries to come, the city's greatest challenges and greatest strengths would always come from its astonishing diversity.
New York did not remain Dutch long. There's several reasons. One is it really was not the financial success that the Dutch had hoped for. Secondly, and more important, the British were establishing themselves both down in Virginia and moving north, and in Massachusetts, especially around Boston, and coming south through Connecticut. And what the British noticed was there was this troublesome Dutch trading post in the middle of the British North American Empire.
Stuyvesant's tragedy is that no sooner does he get this place all spiffed up and ready for action than the English sail in and take the place.
On August 27, 1664, 4 heavily armed English warships sailed into the harbor. Peter Stuyvesant climbed painfully to the top of Fort Amsterdam and made ready for battle. "I had rather be carried to my grave than surrender," he said. But before a shot could be fired, he was handed a petition that had been signed by 93 of the town's leading merchants, including his own son.
His citizens, only partly Dutch, looked at the guns of the British fleet, knew that they had a small little town which was made out of wood and closely built up, and that the British guns would have quickly reduced the city to a smoking ruin, and they implored Stuyvesant to turn over the city, which he did, and with drums beating and flags flying, he marched out of this fort.
Pete grumbled, but he had to surrender because the citizens of the town said, "We won't lift a finger to fight the English. Why would we care who ran this colony or who taxed us? We'd be perfectly happy to have the English. You haven't done much of a job."
In the years to come, Peter Stuyvesant, the man who first brought order to the city and thus assured its future, would retire to a sprawling fruit farm north of town, on open land that would one day become Greenwich Village. The English governor who replaced him graciously offered free passage back to Holland to any Dutch citizens unwilling to accept English rule. No one took him up on it. 2 days after the English takeover, on August 29, 1664, New Amsterdam was officially renamed New York in honor of the Duke of York, the brother of King Charles, to whom the colony had been promised as a birthday present. The day after that, everyone went back to work, as if nothing much had happened after all.
One of the continuities between Dutch and English rule in colonial New York is this aggressive policy toward the Native American population. Clearly, the destruction of the Iroquois population and the Canarsie population in Manhattan and Long Island is a byproduct of British expansion in those areas. Daniel Denton, who in the 1660s writes one of the first English language histories of the region, or sort of general descriptions of the region, says something rather interesting. Everywhere that the English have gone, the invisible hand of God has prepared a space for them by destroying and removing the native population. My response to that is that men acted far more often than God, and it was the British who prepared that space. They destroyed the native population aggressively through war. They encouraged wars between Native American tribes and nations, and the spread of disease just really reduced a huge portion of this lower New York population.
In the end, it would be the fate of New York's original inhabitants to be remembered, when they were remembered at all, as place names in what had become the most completely man-made environment on Earth. The Dutch and English had set in motion a process of change that would never stop until the entire human and natural landscape of Manhattan Island had been completely replaced. For the next 119 years, England would rule New York. What for the Dutch had been a second-rate outpost of empire was for the English the missing link in a chain of royal colonies stretching the length of the Atlantic seaboard. Slowly but surely, the new English governors brought the colony into the imperial system, reorganizing the lands around the harbor and naming them after members of the royal family. The flatlands around Brooklyn were named Kings County in honor of King Charles, and the region to the north, Queens, in honor of his wife, Catherine. Staten Island was named Richmond, after the Duke of Richmond, the king's bastard son. Though they did everything they could to ease the transition, the English found it no easier than the Dutch to keep order in the unruly colony. In 1689, a local merchant named Jacob Leisler led an armed uprising against the government. It was soon put down, and Leisler himself tried for treason and sentenced to be hanged, disemboweled while still alive, drawn and quartered, and then beheaded. A few years later, trouble erupted again when a new monarch, Queen Anne, placed her own cousin, an imperious viscount named Lord Cornbury, in charge of the volatile colony. Petitioning the Queen for his dismissal, Cornbury's enemies did everything they could to ruin his reputation, accusing him of embezzling public funds, persecuting Presbyterians, and it was later said, of having a special liking for women's clothing.
The story that's told is that he wanted to look as much like his cousin Queen Anne, for whom he was ruling the colony, as possible, and to do this, he dressed up in women's clothes and, to quote some early sources, flounced around the Battery. In fact, there's a portrait of him at the New York Historical Society dressed in a kind of a wasp waist blue number that's very nice indeed. And you walk by and you think, what an ugly woman. And then you go back and you realize that, no, it's in fact Lord Cornbury.
But for all the problems, membership in the British Empire brought enormous rewards, as England soon surpassed Holland as the greatest maritime empire on earth, and connected the colony to a network of trade that stretched around the globe.
The more trade routes are developed, the more this becomes a nexus point of flow between England and the Caribbean and the continent, the more people who are local domestic producers, who up till then have produced for a local market only, begin to say, whoa, there are serious possibilities here. This was a trading post. This was a place that was about shipping food down to the West Indies, bringing sugar and slaves back from the West Indies. But you can't run a mercantile operation without a manufacturing component. So in fact, you need coopers, you need barrel makers. You're gonna have ships, you need shipyards. Ships, you need sails, you need sail makers, you need rope makers. So rope walks are sort of festooned all over New York City.
Year after year, the number of ships sailing out of New York Harbor surged upwards, from 35 a year at the end of Dutch rule to more than 700 a century later, exporting timber and grain to Britain, carrying manufactured goods from England to Africa, and importing rum, molasses, and slaves from Africa and the West Indies. In 1699, the old Dutch wall was pulled down to make way for new houses, and a new lane paved over it, called Wall Street. By 1740, New York had become the third largest port in the British Empire, second only to Philadelphia and London itself. It was home now to an uneasy assortment of old Dutch families and English merchants, privateers and colonial administrators, Protestants and Catholics, free blacks, slave owners, and slaves.
While we'd like to think that by the 18th century, New York City was really a model of tolerance and everybody could get along, in fact, there's evidence that there was a lot of resentments, the Dutch versus the English, other groups coming in. The Jews were here, but they weren't really fully accepted. Blacks, of course, and African Americans were much the most discriminated against. So it was not a wonderful love fest going on in New York in the 1740s. And in fact, there were a lot of fears.
In the winter of 1741, the royal colony exploded over an issue that had troubled it from the very start.
Well, of course, I think that what sets the African-American experience apart from the other immigrants is we did not come through Ellis Island. We did not come escaping anything. We were brought here against our will to work, and work we did. In fact, we built the wall for which Wall Street is named. Not only literally, but figuratively, in terms of it was the trade in African flesh that provided the fundamental capital on which Wall Street, the financial wall, is built. So yes, our experience is different.
Slavery is the key word. It's key not only in the fact that blacks are used as a public works infrastructure workforce. I mean, they build roads, they build forts, they build walls and the like. But more to the point, the city's raison d'etre at that point is about the connection to the Caribbean slave South and then later on to the mainland slave South. On the one hand, we've got this kind of business-oriented, cosmopolitan city. On the other hand, there's a profound cleavage, and it's based on the exploitation of slave labor.
Some white New Yorkers thought the practice barbaric. Slaveholding depraves the mind, one Quaker minister said, with as great certainty as cold congeals water. But year by year, as New York expanded, the demand for slaves grew. By 1740, 1 in 6 New Yorkers were owned by other New Yorkers. 2,000 men, women, and children in all. Each morning, African Americans could be seen strolling to the slave market at the foot of Wall Street, where they waited to be rented out for use as day laborers, exchanging news with free blacks and looking for every chance they could to break free.
There had been a variety of slave rebellions in the colonies, and I think that New Yorkers were very much aware of these slave rebellions. As the number of slaves increased, they were also very afraid that New Yorkers were at risk. They noticed slaves gathering together. They had put prohibitions on slaves meeting on street corners, but they knew that slaves were interested in gaining their freedom in any way that they could, and they were very fearful of open revolt.
Memories of a bloody slave uprising years before were still vivid in the minds of white New Yorkers, when in the winter of 1741, a series of mysterious fires began breaking out all over the city, burning the King's Chapel, the Army Barracks, and the homes and businesses of prominent New Yorkers. Suspicion quickly fell on the city's black population.
The recorder, taking notice of the several fires which have lately happened in this city, must necessarily conclude that they were occasioned by some villainous confederacy of latent enemies amongst us. Daniel Horsemanden.
In March, as the authorities searched frantically for the guilty parties, an indentured servant named Mary Burton, prompted by the prospect of a $100 reward, came forward to testify against her employer, an Irish Catholic tavern keeper named John Hewson, whose establishment was a favorite meeting place for slaves and free blacks. She told wild tales of a Negro plot to burn the city and overthrow the government, leveling one charge after another against Hewson, his wife, and a growing list of alleged black conspirators.
One gets the feeling that Mary Burton forgot what the truth was. Her stories kept getting more and more elaborate as she implicated more and more individuals in the subversion, and she was absolutely convincing because the officials, the New York City officials, wanted to be convinced that this was a wider conspiracy.
There were levels of conspiracy that probably actually were invented by the people investigating the conspiracy. So for instance, the belief that Catholics, and particularly Irish Catholics, were responsible for creating this discontent among the slaves was probably an invention of Protestants looking to protect their self-esteem as masters and looking to reinforce their racial ideas that Africans were incapable of plotting against them on their own.
Some blacks had almost certainly been involved. But as the hysteria in Manhattan reached fever pitch, colonial judges ordered a massive roundup of black New Yorkers, and with almost no evidence, put them on trial for their lives. In the weeks to come, the reign of terror visited on blacks, and on anyone suspected of conspiring with them, would be worse than the Salem witch trials half a century before.
The real story of 1741 is in fact not what the slaves did, but in fact what was done to the slaves. The level of ferocity with which the insurrection was repressed, and then the punishments that were meted out, despite the fact that these were valuable pieces of property, People were burned at the stake. People were roasted over a slow fire for 8 hours that the torment may be dragged out. Medieval tortures, which in fact had been utterly banned for conventional and white purposes, were in fact resurrected to strike terror into the hearts of the population.
Before it was over, 16 blacks and 4 whites had been hanged in New York. 13 slaves had been burned at the stake, and 70 more deported. It would take nearly a century more for black New Yorkers to win their freedom. But it would not be long before English rule was challenged again. Not by African Americans this time, but by the city's restless merchant middle class and an alliance of artisans and sailors. When that happened, the proud royal colony would begin a long journey out of empire, out of the past, and into the future.
Trade was big, but war was bigger in certain periods. In 1756, William Smith writes in his diary, "War is declared in England universal joy among the merchants." And why? Because in fact, New York City is the central base of operations by the British against their classic enemy, the French, in North America and the Caribbean. What does this mean? This means that in 1758, there are 25,000 British troops and 14,000 Marines in North America, overwhelmingly based in New York City. This means all these people need food. They need clothing and uniforms. They need ship repairs. They need sex and R&R. So the merchants are happy. The whores are happy. The innkeepers are happy. There is money pouring into the economy. Benjamin Franklin, with great envy, writes in 58, "God, these merchants are cleaning up." So this is, in fact, a moment of maximum satisfaction with the empire by the biggest and most powerful merchants in New York City, because the benefits of being on the right side of the British Navy have never been more apparent. The trouble is with wars is peace, from the perspective of the war is good for business school. And in 1763, the British fleet sails away, the defense contracts peter out, and the city, in fact, falls into a depression. 1763 is hard times. All that money that was pouring in is not pouring in. Worse, the British now say, okay, you owe us. And we are now in a whole new universe. Taxes and extraction of resources at the moment of maximum weakness in the economy. This is the background within which there is going to be the beginning of the road to revolution.
If the interest of the mother country and her colonies cannot be made to coincide, then the connection between them ought to cease. The New York Gazette, 1765.
It began in the spring of 1765, when England passed the Stamp Act. A tax on 43 kinds of business transactions, from legal contracts to liquor licenses. It threatened the very lifeblood of New York's vibrant merchant culture.
There wasn't a person in America who wasn't mad at the Stamp Act because it attacked lawyers. It attacked sailors who would have to pay a tax every time they bought playing cards. It attacked brides-to-be who would have to pay when their marriage license was taken out. It attacked newspaper owners, so there's no question that New York City would have been a bizarre place indeed if there weren't as much hostility to the Stamp Act here as there were in Boston or in Philadelphia, or for that matter in the countryside.
On November 1st, 1765, the day the act was to take effect, an angry mob gathered on New York Commons, then marched down to the Bowling Green, where they hanged and burnt an effigy of the royal governor, then set his carriage on fire. The Stamp Act was quickly repealed, and grateful New Yorkers soon erected a huge bronze statue of King George III to affirm their loyalty to the British Crown. But their gratitude did not last long, as one intolerable act followed another, until the stage had been set for complete separation from the mother country.
People have always come to cities to take on a new identity since the Middle Ages. Breathing the city air makes you free, they said in the Middle Ages. That's never been more true about a place like New York. People come here from all over the world, not just from the interior of the United States, from all over the world to make themselves up. If you want to be who you are, you stay where you are. If you want to be somebody else, if you want to be part of something new, you come to New York. That's been true, I think, through the life of the city.
In June 1773, an illegitimate 16-year-old boy from the West Indian island of Nevis landed in the divided colony. Like a seed blown by happy chance onto perfect ground, one man later said, the young Alexander Hamilton arrived in New York on the eve of an extraordinary transformation. In the years to come, he would do everything in his power to hurry the city on toward its ultimate destiny.
He is, after all, a bastard from the West Indies. He is the quintessential upstart. He's not born in America. He's got no long history. He's a New Yorker, very much a New Yorker. And his belief that anybody who had intelligence and ability had a right to rise is certainly very much the New York immigrant story.
Hamilton threw himself almost immediately into the whirlwind of debate sweeping through the colony. In 1774, while still a sophomore at King's College, he published an incendiary pamphlet urging New Yorkers to defy the English Parliament and lay claim to their natural rights as free men. He was soon mesmerizing crowds on the New York Commons with his fiery political oratory.
I think the image of Alexander Hamilton at the age of 17 being able to incite entire mobs of New Yorkers to rebel against the British crown. To me, there is something so typically New York about that. I mean, here you have this guy who comes to probably the only place he could have come to in the United States and really made a name for himself. And immediately, through his own brilliance, but also because the city is so accepting, becomes this important political figure while he's still a teenager.
Hamilton wanted that war badly, no matter what the issues were, because very early on he said, it is in war that a man makes his reputation, and it is in moments of flux and change that a man can rise. So unlike some of the established political leaders of New York, he's certainly someone who wants to see the revolution come on, no matter what.
To the shock of most loyal New Yorkers, Hamilton's wish came true sooner than even he could have imagined. On Sunday, April 23rd, 1775, a frantic messenger came galloping into town down the post road from Boston. Blood had been shed at Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had started. In New York, jubilant patriots immediately seized control of the Customs House and City Hall. Alexander Hamilton threw himself into the revolutionary fervor, eventually rising to become one of George Washington's closest aides. But a cloud of gloom soon fell over the island city, as even the most ardent of patriots could see that Manhattan would be all but defenseless before the guns of the British Navy. Within days, a massive evacuation of New York had begun. In the next 9 months, 80% of the city's population fled Manhattan.
April 29th, 1775. The past week has been one of commotion and confusion. Fear and panic seized many of the people who prepared to move into the country. August 28th. Moving out of the city continues, and some of the streets look plague-stricken. So many houses are closed.
What Americans really don't realize is the pivotal role that New York had in the American Revolution. Certainly the British realized it from the very beginning. And they looked at the map, and they saw that New York is almost equidistant between the two most important colonies in the New World, Massachusetts and Virginia. And indeed, the British strategy was take New York City, have another force come down the Hudson River, split the colonies from the get-go, and hopefully bring this rebellion to a quick and happy conclusion from the point of view of the British Parliament.
In the spring of 1776, General George Washington, the newly appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, rushed his untrained troops to Manhattan, certain that the British would strike there first.
Should they get New York and command of the Hudson, they can stop the intercourse between northern and southern colonies, upon which depends the safety of America. George Washington.
I feel for you, my New York friends, for I expect that your city will be laid to ashes. The American Mercury.
I was upstairs and spied, as I peeped out the bay, something resembling a wood of pine trees trimmed. I could not believe my eyes. I thought all London was afloat. Private Daniel McCurtain.
On the morning of June 29th, 1776, New Yorkers awoke to an unforgettable sight. During the night, more than 100 British warships had sailed into New York Harbor. In the weeks to come, nearly 500 English vessels carrying more than 32,000 British and Hessian soldiers and 10,000 sailors would drop anchor in the lower bay. It was the largest land-sea expeditionary force mounted by Great Britain until the Normandy invasion during World War II. It took 6 weeks for the giant force to disembark and take up positions on Staten Island.
You can imagine a farmer on Staten Island waking up one morning and seeing a harbor full of warships sailing in to realize that, oops, perhaps England is too mighty to have risen up in rebellion against her.
Across the harbor, New York City braced for war. On July 9th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was read aloud for the first time in Manhattan on the city commons. Afterwards, a cheering throng of soldiers and civilians marched down to the Bowling Green and pulled the statue of King George from its pedestal. The 2 tons of British lead were melted down and turned into 42,088 American bullets.
George Washington, who was still learning about being a general in the summer of 1776, had a real challenge in front of him. He knew the importance of New York City strategically. He knew the British wanted to take it. His problem, though, is in order to defend Manhattan, the kind of bluffs of Brooklyn overlook it. If the British took the bluffs, then their guns and everything would be looking down on his city. So he needed to defend Brooklyn. The danger of defending Brooklyn is that Brooklyn is separated really from the mainland of the United States, and you're taking on the foremost maritime power on earth. So George Washington took a gamble, moved his main forces to the Brooklyn side of the East River and the Upper Bay, and there confronted the British Army.
On August 26th, 1776, the battle for New York began, when 20,000 British soldiers were ferried from Staten Island and began moving towards Washington's much smaller force, dug in south of Brooklyn Heights. For the Americans, it was a disaster from the start. In just 2 days, Washington lost almost 2,000 men, a quarter of his army. On the rain-soaked night of August 29th, 1776, with his shattered forces pinned against the East River, the American commander gambled everything on an extraordinary military maneuver. Commandeering every skiff and fishing boat he could lay his hands on, Washington tried to ferry his exhausted men across the East River to Manhattan. In total darkness, without a sound, in less than 7 hours.
It was dark and it was foggy when they evacuated 12,000 of our troops, Washington's army, across the East River. Washington's army was saved that night. Imagine 12,000 soldiers making their way down to the river's edge in the dark to be rowed across in the fog on those big flat-bottomed boats, knowing that they could be caught at any moment, knowing they were in retreat, knowing that the British Army was close on their heels, and doing it all with perfect discipline and surviving to fight another day. And it changed the course of history that night, right there on the East River.
Certain he could no longer defend the city, Washington retreated up the length of Manhattan, fighting bloody rearguard actions along a country lane that would one day be Upper Broadway. From his field headquarters in Upper Manhattan, he could just see the British flag flying over the city he could not save. In November, with the British Army in hot pursuit, Washington abandoned Manhattan completely.
But essentially the goal was protect the army, don't protect the place. Very nearly as the Vietnamese fought the United States in the Vietnam War. You're fighting a little country, fighting the leading military power in the world. The most important thing to do is keep the war going on, and sooner or later this great power will tire of the effort and leave. And that's in fact what the British did, and I think that lesson was learned in New York in 1776.
For 7 long years, the Revolutionary War raged. New York was no longer a city, but a British garrison, the largest military base on Earth, home to a handful of patriots and more than 10,000 British troops and officers. Spurred on by British offers of emancipation, thousands of slaves from around the country poured into New York. To free themselves in the war for American freedom, blacks had to join the other side. Though the streets of Manhattan never saw fighting again, the destruction New Yorkers had for so long feared came anyway. On September 21st, 1776, 4 days after the British occupation began, a fire broke out near Whitehall Street. With the fire brigade gone off to war, the blaze moved north unchecked, engulfing building after building, including the proud spire of Trinity Church, the tallest structure in town. The 140-foot-high wooden steeple, one man said, soon resembled a vast pyramid of fire. Before it was over, 500 buildings had been destroyed, and the entire western half of New York City lay in ruin.
The British took over. Loyalists from everywhere flooded into New York City. New York was, in essence, a British stronghold throughout the entire war. It played, in that sense, no role in the American Revolution. The city couldn't claim to have been critical, except insofar as long as the British held it, this was a major headache for Washington. And at the very last minute, you know how important New York City was, because when the French finally agreed to use their fleet to help Washington out, Washington rubbed his hands together and said, "Let's get New York."
Little by little, the tide of battle turned. In 1778, the French entered the war on the American side, and Dutch businessmen loaned 5 million guilders to help the Patriot cause. Finally, the English capitulated completely. On November 25th, 1783, George Washington led his army triumphantly back into New York City. The British surrendered to the Americans inside the old fort at the foot of Manhattan, where Peter Stuyvesant had surrendered the Dutch colony to the British 119 years before. The Union Jack was lowered. The Stars and Stripes were raised. Crowds cheered and cannon boomed. New York was an American city at last, though no one yet knew precisely what that would mean. When New York's exiled citizens returned after 7 years of war, they were shocked by what they found. The city lay in ruins. Thousands of families loyal to the English cause had fled forever, and the hulks of abandoned, half-ruined mansions were visible everywhere. No other American city had experienced anything like it.
The American Revolution had a profound influence on the city of New York. First of all, the city burned. One reason we don't think of New York as so historic is because so little survives from the 17th or 18th century. And in a way, that's the kickoff point for the rise of New York City to be, in a way, the great metropolis of the world. It was there in the end of the American Revolution. It was small, it was depopulated, much of its leadership had left, very little was going on. And somehow, in the next half century, or less, this small trading post becomes the most important city in the Western Hemisphere.
To an astonishing degree, the key to New York City's rise, and with it the rise of America itself to urban greatness, would lie in the hands of one man, the brilliant, combative immigrant from the West Indies, Alexander Hamilton.
No one in his own era disputed his genius. There were people who didn't like him. There were people who wished him dead and one who killed him. But no one disputed his genius. And the brightest of them understood exactly that this was a man to be feared. Not because of his personal power, but because of the vision that he had for the development of the country.
Within days of the British surrender, Hamilton had joined the flood of New Yorkers returning to the city, bringing with him his wife and infant son. They settled in a house at 57 Wall Street, just down the street from his arch-enemy and political rival, Aaron Burr. Within a matter of months, he had opened his own law firm, helped set up a society for the emancipation of slaves, then organized the city's first bank, the Bank of New York, which opened for business a few blocks away. In 1785, new neighbors arrived. The brand new Continental Congress, unable to decide on a permanent home, set up temporary headquarters in New York City, on Wall Street, right next door to the Hamiltons. In the years to come, Hamilton would do everything in his power to keep the capital in Manhattan, convinced the future of America lay not in the countryside, but in the city.
He made what is essentially the ultimate urban argument that city air breathes free. It was his argument that people are freer, there's a greater exchange of ideas, there's more opportunity for men to acquire wealth in a commercial urban universe.
Most people don't realize New York was really the first capital of the United States. Indeed, if the United States were like every other major country in the world, it would have been the capital.
New York was a very logical place for a national capital. It was easy to get to. It was relatively centrally located. Historians should never play the game of what if, but still it's hard not to wonder what New York City would have been like had it become the political capital as well as the commercial, financial, and creative capital of the country.
At noon on April 30th, 1789, George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States in New York City, from the balcony of the old City Hall, which New Yorkers had optimistically renamed Federal Hall. The new president quickly brought in Thomas Jefferson to be Secretary of State, though the Virginian loathed New York, which he called a sewer, filled with all the depravities of human nature. Alexander Hamilton, just 33, was named the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury. And though the appointment came through on a Saturday, he went right to work. From his new office in the Treasury Department on Broadway, a few steps from newly rebuilt Trinity Church, Hamilton began mapping out the blueprint for a new kind of nation. One based not on plantations and slave labor, but on commerce, manufacturing, and immigrant toil. To a startling degree, he was mapping out the future of New York.
Look at what he understood in a country that was 90% agrarian. Here's a man who understood that the future of the country was in manufacturing. Here's a man who understood what banking could do to develop the economy of the country. How you could use tax money from the many, put it in the hands of the few, and produce, as a result, a manufacturing revolution, the beginnings of industrialization in a country that was, 2 decades old.
Southern planters immediately rose up in opposition to Hamilton's program. The mobs of great cities, Jefferson warned, add just so much to the support of pure government as sores do to the strength of the human body. Certain the nation's future lay not in the city, but in the countryside, Jefferson insisted the capital be moved out of New York to a rural setting just across the Potomac from his native Virginia. It was the beginning of a fateful split in American life, one that would pit South against North, country against city, and lead ultimately to civil war.
Jefferson had this vision of the country being an agrarian country full of yeoman farmers. It was a vision that never existed even in his time, certainly not as he would have liked to have seen it. But he loved that vision, and he hated all things commercial. Hamilton loved commerce. He understood money, banking and money and flow of power through the economy. Unlike Jefferson, who never understood money at all, and which may account for why he was born one of the richest people in the colonies and died deeply, deeply in debt.
Already, this split between a commercial manufacturing society and an agrarian staple crop-based society, between dynamic capital and capital that was invested in property and slaves and not as manipulable. These splits were already evolving given Hamilton's programs for the new nation.
In the spring of 1790, the debate over the capital came to a fateful climax, over another volatile issue, crucial to the success of Hamilton's economic programs.
There was at that time a major issue dividing the new nation, and that is the debt incurred during the Revolutionary War by the respective colonies at that time. Some had not incurred much, others, such as Virginia, had paid theirs off. New York had the most. Well, New York should have had the most. It's where the most important fighting took place. Hamilton had one idea for the new nation, which is take up all that debt and have the federal government say, we'll pay for it. You incurred this debt honorably. In the aftermath, we have a national government. The national government will pay that debt for you, don't you worry.
But once again, Southerners were adamantly opposed to Hamilton's vision, reluctant to pay off Northern debts and fearful of increasing Northern power. With Congress hopelessly deadlocked, it was now an open question, one congressman warned, whether this government is to exist for the ages or be dispersed among contending winds. On the evening of June 20th, 1790, with the government hovering on the brink of bankruptcy, Hamilton went to Jefferson's house on Maiden Lane, hoping to find some way out of the crisis.
He said to Jefferson on that fateful meeting, we have to assume the Revolutionary War debt. Jefferson made a fateful offer. He said, all right, we'll do it. If you move the capital of this new nation from its natural site in Manhattan to a swamp on the banks of the Potomac, which turns malarial in April, such that any congressman who stays around till May will never get back. And what could Hamilton do? He accepted it.
He was smart enough to know that wherever the government was located, if it was pursuing the kind of aggressive developmental programs that he wanted it to pursue, that he was going to win in the long run. It was more important what the government did than where the government did it, was Hamilton's view.
And ever since, one of the defining characteristics of the United States has been that the political capital was in one place, and the cultural, economic, intellectual capital was in another place, because that never left New York.
Some New Yorkers were devastated by the loss of the capital, but Hamilton himself was philosophical. Almost immediately, he had the Treasury Department issue $80 million in government bonds to pay off the huge new debt the federal government had assumed, and money was soon flooding into New York as the trade in government bonds soared. On May 17, 1792, 24 stockbrokers gathered under a buttonwood tree on Wall Street to figure out how to handle the enormous volume of business Hamilton had generated. It was the beginning of the New York Stock Exchange.
I think one of the real turning points in the history of New York is that it doesn't become the federal capital. If it had ever become the federal capital, it would have been an entirely different city. It would have been a kind of London, very concerned with its past. It would have had military monuments. It doesn't have that. It just remained a place to do commerce, to come here. People came all the time to make money.
If it had become the capital, of course, the city would have been much more outlooking. It would have had to encompass the entire country. Whereas being freed of being a political capital, it was able to look after only its own interests and to pursue those interests with great vigor.
I really have this sense that New Yorkers said, well, if you don't want us to be your capital, that's fine. We'll just go it alone. We don't really need the rest of you. We will simply make all of you a suburb. And we will become the commercial emporium of the New World.
It was the beginning of the greatest run any city has ever had. Almost single-handedly, Alexander Hamilton had kicked into life the most powerful economic engine on earth. Along the way, he had helped invent the future, not only for himself, but for the city and country that had allowed him to rise.
I think he believed that meritocracy, which is the way in which Americans join capitalism and democracy. It is the way in which there can be great wealth, but there can be no barriers to anyone of talent, hard work, determination, and ability achieving them. I think that that combines the two. He was no friend to real democracy. He was not at all interested in the masses of people having political voices. But I think he was very much interested in creating a dynamic society in which anyone of ability could rise. That's really American democracy in action.
In 1799, Hamilton's efforts to end slavery in New York State finally bore partial fruit when the Gradual Emancipation Act was passed. 1 year later, Hamilton left government and retired to a handsome estate in Upper Manhattan and watched his city grow. By 1804, New York's population had more than doubled in less than a decade, climbing to 80,000. That year, for the first time in its history, New York surpassed Philadelphia, though Hamilton himself would not be around to savor the triumph.
He was challenged to a duel by Aaron Burr, whose political career in New York Hamilton had almost single-handedly destroyed. Now, they couldn't duel in New York because Hamilton had been instrumental in getting a law passed forbidding dueling in New York. His own son had been killed in a duel. So they adjourned to Weehawken, New Jersey, and do battle in the early morning in 1804. Of course, when they got there, for whatever reason, it is true, Hamilton's shot went into the air, and Burr's shot went into Hamilton. And he died what must have been a quite painful, lingering death overnight, and was astoundingly mourned. A man who in many ways had never been a popular idol and had made bitter, bitter enemies. It was recognized that the country had lost an extraordinary figure.
On July 13th, 1804, after one of the largest funeral processions in the city's history, Alexander Hamilton was buried with full military honors in the graveyard of Trinity Church, just across Broadway from Wall Street, in the heart of the city whose future he had done so much to secure. He was just 47 years old. New York was on its way. In the century to come, the world that would rise up around Hamilton's final resting place would be a stunning monument to the magnitude of his achievement.
First thing about a commercial culture is that it will be continuously changing. It will embody what Schumpeter called the creative destruction of capitalism.
This place is about endless recomposition. There is very little compunction about tearing things down and putting up something new in their place. Again, there's plus sides to this. Marx, in fact, said this is one of its plus sides. He hailed capitalism because, again, it was ruthless. It was perfectly willing to demolish all constraints on production and profitability, which means that it's open to innovation, it's open to possibility, it's not tethered by the past. And this is an extremely American notion, and in this, perhaps New York is at its most American.
In a way, it can be seen as a metaphor for our whole way of life, that we are forever changing it, improving it, revising it, because it is never finished. That's the idea. Manhattan, for all that may be overwhelming about it, is a marvelous expression of the aspiration and the creative vitality of our country. It's a magnificent, creative phenomenon. And if you could have one of those time-lapse films of it going up and down and rising and falling, you would sense that in there is the expression of its own life.
Almost 200 years had elapsed since Europeans first set eyes on the vast and tranquil harbor, in which they dreamed 1,000 ships might one day ride in safety. Now at last, the vision of the old Dutch explorers was about to become a reality. Galvanized by the energies unleashed in New York, entrepreneurs and inventors from around the country converged on the island city. In 1807, a transplanted Pennsylvanian named Robert Fulton launched the world's first practical steamboat off the west side of Manhattan. It looked like a backwoods sawmill, one man said, mounted on a scow and set on fire. But it freed ships forever from the tyranny of the wind. 3 years later, a 16-year-old boy from Staten Island purchased a second-hand sailboat with $100 borrowed from his mother and started a ferry service to Manhattan. Mockingly called the Commodore by his rivals, Cornelius Vanderbilt had begun to build the greatest shipping empire on Earth. In 1817, a company called the Blackball Line came up with a startlingly simple idea that would revolutionize shipping around the world: regularly scheduled departures.
Prior to that time, you actually sailed when you got a crew together, or when the hole filled up, or when it suited you, or when the weather was nice. The leaders of the Blackball Line said, "We will sail at 10 a.m., full or none." And this initiated a revolution in trading, because then merchants could count on delivery at a certain time, could make obligations, and this attracted business to New York. And then it began to feed on itself, so that New York rapidly became not just another port competing with Baltimore and Boston and Philadelphia, but the port, a port far larger than all the rest of them combined.
As ships from around the world streamed in and out of the harbor, the city began to explode northward with astonishing speed. One by one, the old Dutch farms and English estates north of town were carved up into smaller and smaller lots and sold to builders and speculators. By 1807, a 44-year-old German-born fur trader named John Jacob Astor had begun buying up every piece of undeveloped land he could lay his hands on.
What was happening was that Manhattan real estate was becoming among the most expensive in the world. Indeed, the first great fortune in the United States was made by John Jacob Astor, not so much on the fur trade, for which he's famous, but because he began to buy Manhattan real estate, early part of the 19th century.
He discerns the most obvious fact of Manhattan's development, which is that it's moving north. And if you get up there first and you buy up the land, you are in a position to, depending on your moral perspective, profit from, garner, or extort the folks who come later.
Insatiable, arrogant, and notoriously crude, Astor shocked New York society with his appalling table manners, drawing pictures on the window pane with a wet tobacco chaw and wiping his hands on the table linen. But at least to his face, no one said a word, as gambling on the future of New York made John Jacob Astor the wealthiest man in America.
And just before he died, in 1848, he said that if he had life to live over again, knowing then what he knew now, he would buy every square foot of the island of Manhattan.
Only one thing seemed to be missing now, as New York soared into the future and its citizens compared their brash young city to the great capitals of Europe and Asia. The glory of an ancient past. In 1809, as the hunger for history grew stronger, a curious volume went on sale in the city's bookstores called A History of New York, From the Beginning of the World to the End of the Dutch Dynasty. Presented as the work of an elderly Dutchman named Dietrich Knickerbocker, its author was in fact a 26-year-old native-born New Yorker named Washington Irving. Not a history at all, but a whimsical blend of fact and fiction. It offered New Yorkers a mock-heroic past, reimagining the unruly Dutch colony as an enchanted fairyland the Dutch themselves would scarcely have recognized.
I think it is true that Irving gives it a mythical history, which any place has to have. Unlike European cities that it was going to try to imitate, it didn't have thousands of years. So it had to create its history and its present and its future, and it had to do it at the same time imitating European models, but insisting that it was going to be distinctive.
Irving's fictional history quickly became the city's first bestseller, and Irving himself the first man in America to earn his living solely by his pen. Popularizing historical figures like Peter Stuyvesant and fictional ones like Rip Van Winkle, and giving the city its first nickname, Gotham. Father Knickerbocker himself became the unofficial symbol of New York City, and soon even the oldest families were calling themselves Knickerbockers, proudly tracing their lineage back to a man who never existed.
One thing about New York is that New York has always made its own myth. Washington Irving created the myth of the Knickerbocker families. He already probably sensed with the arrivals of the Astors and the Vanderbilts that the old families that went back to the Dutch colonial era were waning in their influence. So he created a myth for them. And he created Dietrich Knickerbocker, and he created these stories.
If it had done nothing more, New York City would have remained forever after the greatest port on the Atlantic seaboard. But a larger destiny lay in store, and to achieve it, two immense obstacles would have to be overcome. One was the geography of Manhattan Island, whose rugged natural landscape was a hindrance to orderly growth. The other was the geography of the American continent, to whose vast interior riches the city's merchants still had no easy access. The man who would attempt to solve both problems, and in so doing stake a claim to being the greatest New Yorker of all time, was a 6'3" patrician politician, so brilliant and commanding that friends and enemies alike called him Magnus Apollo. In 10 terms as mayor of the city, and 3 as governor of the state, DeWitt Clinton would do more to shape the future of New York than anyone else in its history. To do that, he would first have to bring order out of chaos, then reach westward and transform geography itself.
DeWitt Clinton is arguably the most important person who ever lived in New York, and I understand that this is an environment that included Peter Stuyvesant and Robert Moses and Franklin D. Roosevelt and Fiorello LaGuardia. But DeWitt Clinton was there at the critical moment in New York City's history when it was not clear that it would be the dominant city that it later became.
DeWitt Clinton had a vision of New York that was not to be the official capital of the United States. And he understood its bases to be the economy and culture. And it was to those two things that he devoted himself with extraordinary focus.
An admirer of Alexander Hamilton and heir to Hamilton's glorious commercial vision of New York, Clinton would finish laying the foundation of the modern city. In 1807, to help bring order to the chaos of the city's rapid northward growth, he oversaw the creation of a special commission to come up with what he hoped would be a final and conclusive plan for the development of Manhattan Island.
There lay before the city fathers a vast island, another 10 miles of it roughly, running north-south. How would they organize it? Commissioners organized it in a very American way, a very Jeffersonian way, on a grid.
In 1811, the commissioners unveiled their plan. On a giant map, more than 8 feet long, they had projected an astonishing vision of the future that would shape the destiny of Manhattan for centuries to come.
The grid is the most courageous act of prediction in Western civilization. The land it divides, unoccupied. The population it describes, conjectural. The buildings it locates, phantoms. Rem Koolhaas.
At a time when New York City was still huddled at the southern tip of Manhattan, Clinton's commissioners proposed leveling the entire natural geography of the island and replacing it with a single massive grid, 12 avenues wide and 155 streets long, covering 11,000 acres with more than 2,000 blocks. There had been grid plans before, but never on this scale. At a time when the city held fewer than 100,000 people, the plan envisioned a giant metropolis of more than 1 million. If realized, it would transform Manhattan into the most populous city on Earth.
It was an extraordinary thing to impose geometry on an island. It was an enchanting island. It was all covered with oak and hemlock and fir, and there were lots of ponds and streams and springs, and it was all up and down hill. And instead of allowing for the ups and downs and saving the brooks and streams and everything, this gridiron, this really cruel gridiron, torturous method was laid down over the whole island.
In the pre-grid days, we respected nature, partly because we couldn't do much about it. So roads go around hills, they circumvent ponds. No more. Now, hills were to be leveled and thrown into ponds. Land was to be filled in. This was to become one of the most man-made, artificial spaces in the history of the planet.
Inscribed within the grid was an extraordinary vision of what New Yorkers wanted their city to be.
One, imperial. There's a sense of expansion northward. The numbers run up. Two, democratic, because the streets are going to be numbered. They're not going to be named. Three, efficient. It makes it easy for immigrants, people who don't speak English, to navigate their way around to their workplace and to selling places. Four, a sense of routinizing and regularizing the real estate market, because everything is gridded up in advance so that you can buy and sell plots easily with great convenience. Perhaps the most extraordinary is the conviction that you are going to totally triumph over nature. And the notion that you can in fact shape, reshape, reformulate things is again right near the bone of the New York idea.
With its thousands of blocks, each more or less identical to every other, the grid envisioned a remarkably uniform and democratic city. And with its hundreds of streets leading down to the rivers, a relentlessly commercial one. The almost complete absence of park space in the commissioner's plan would haunt the city for decades to come.
And you know, the grid is often attacked. People say that it's capitalist speculation, or that it's an unlovely form, you know. They say that it's monotonous, it's totalitarian. I don't think anybody who's ever been in the New York grid, if he's honest with himself, experiences it as totalitarian. Too much is happening, it's too interesting. So this is a kind of intellectual idea, a judgment that is overlaid onto it after the fact. So what you have in the grid is a powerful underorder in a city where there is so much anarchy.
And you can stand on any cross street and you can see the river on either side. And also the breeze comes through and you get the sun rising on one side and the sun setting on the other side. It's also quite nice, the big, long, straight avenues that run north-south, which Jean-Paul Sartre admired. He loved these big, straight avenues in which you could see the light always. And they seem somehow, in a way, a representation of American limitlessness, geographic limitlessness.
It's hard to imagine, unless you really set your mind to it, that it was ever anything else. It's almost as if Manhattan had been a city since antiquity, that somehow the Indian tribes that lived here had put down pavement.
That great plan indicated to people who had no intention of stopping. They're going to go right up to the top of the island, to the Harlem River, and go on from there. It was part of an optimism that was real, and it was an optimism that was self-fulfilling. You lay out a street plan like that, and the next thing you know, someone bought a corner lot. And the transportation followed it. It wasn't long before you had horse-drawn trolleys.
The Commissioner's Plan of 1811 was one of the most far-sighted urban visions ever conceived. And yet its audacity was nothing compared to that of another proposal DeWitt Clinton put forward that same year. Not an 8-foot map, but a 363-mile-long ditch that, if completed, would transform forever New York's relation to the entire American continent.
When you think of the United States in 1800, it's really a country that's huddled along the East Coast. Movement to the interior of the North American continent is blocked by what we no longer think is the substantial mountain chains, the Appalachians, the Alleghenies. But from the perspective of 1800, they were impressive indeed. There were no blasted highways through there. There were no railroads through there. There were no rivers that took you easily through there. You had to walk up those mountains and walk down them and then up another one and down. So they were a formidable barrier. And what we had to do, both in New York and in the nation, is to figure out a way to get inside the continent.
For years, New York merchants had been dreaming of the immense wealth locked in the continent's interior. In 1811, DeWitt Clinton came up with a way of getting at it. If nature had provided them no river to the west, New Yorkers would simply have to build one.
When one looks at a map of the United States, and one looks at the Mississippi River, one cannot but assume that the greatest city in the New World is going to be where New Orleans is. That here's one of the greatest river systems in the world. But it didn't happen that way. And it didn't happen that way because New Yorkers took the geographical advantage they had and got access to that agricultural hinterland that seemed to belong to New Orleans.
The only gap in the chain of mountains running from New Hampshire to Georgia is providentially located in New York State. And Governor DeWitt Clinton had enough sense to see that this was a very valuable asset and to build the Erie Canal over the collective dead bodies of most of the politicians from New York City, who did not see that connecting the Middle West to the Hudson and New York City would turn into a cash cow.
The scope of the project was nothing less than mind-boggling. An artificial waterway, unlike anything undertaken since the days of the ancient Egyptians. At a time when the longest canal in America ran just 27 miles, and most less than 2, Clinton's canal would have to run more than 350 miles across the rugged wilderness of upstate New York. Thomas Jefferson himself rejected the scheme outright, calling it little short of madness. So did the New York State Legislature and President James Madison, who warned that its $5 million cost would bankrupt the federal government. But DeWitt Clinton would not be deterred. The Great Erie Canal, he declared, would make New York one of the most splendid commercial cities on the face of the earth. Appealing directly to the public, he lobbied tirelessly for what his detractors called Clinton's Big Ditch, holding mass rallies in New York City and circulating a petition eventually signed by more than 100,000 New Yorkers. Clinton himself devised an ingenious scheme to pay for it all, using public funds to attract private investors and showing once and for all how great public works could be built in a democracy.
How did Clinton build the Erie Canal? By promising bankers he would make money if they lent him the funds to do so. And no ideology about it. Jefferson wouldn't dream of having the national government involving itself in an affair of this kind for doctrinal reasons. The Jeffersonians were against internal improvements. Hamilton was all for them, and boy, did they make money.
In 1817, the state of New York, encouraged by Governor DeWitt Clinton, issued what at the time was a staggering indebtedness, or issuance of bonds, to build this waterway across upstate New York, connecting essentially the Hudson River at Albany with the Great Lakes at Buffalo. That ditch, that 363-mile ditch, only a couple dozen feet wide, was the most important public works project in American history until the Interstate Highway Program was passed in 1956.
The canal was dug with Irishman mules and Monongahela whiskey in about 7 years. A massive feat. And you cross the canal, now it's still there, now clean because Lake Erie is clean. And you go along, about every 15 miles you come to a town where something extraordinary in manufacturing commercial history began.
It was one of the few public works projects in New York that didn't have a cost overrun, was finished on schedule. In fact, had paid for itself by being partially open before it was fully completed.
On October 26, 1825, 3 full years ahead of schedule, the mammoth undertaking was complete. The Great Erie Canal, one observer said, has defied nature and used it like a toy. With 83 locks and 18 aqueducts, including an 800-foot water bridge over the Genesee River, it was the greatest engineering feat of its day. It had also worked nothing less than an economic miracle. It had once cost more to ship a ton of goods 30 miles inland than all the way to England, and taken more than 3 weeks to move a ton of wheat from Buffalo to New York. Now, it took just 7 days, and the cost had been cut from $100 to less than $6. At the opening celebrations, DeWitt Clinton, the undisputed hero of the day, poured a keg of water drawn from Lake Erie into New York Harbor. The symbolism was lost on no one. All America now met in New York.
The mountains have been leveled. The valleys have been filled. Rivers and gulfs have been formed over them, which will unite the waters of the Hudson and the waters of the Atlantic with the waters of the remote West and constitute a river. The Reverend F.H. Cumming.
It just brought things alive in America as they had never done before. And that canal brought the seaborne Atlantic trade right up into the central of the American Great Plains. It was a way west that only we had, and this harbor was the fulcrum between the great continent and the European world on the other side.
It made New York the only American city that connected Europe on one side with the heartland of the continent on the other. And that has been New York's strength ever since. It still is the major port of entry and transfer point for people flying from Europe to the rest of the country. You see New York, and then you see America.
This waterway did so much to pull the nation together. Now the goods from this whole vast region are flowing by canal boats through the Erie Canal and then down the Hudson River to New York City. So that New York City is becoming a kind of national city, pulling the country together. So there is one focus. The national capital may be in Washington, but the real economic capital is by common consent in New York.
The Erie Canal made New York the Empire State, and New York City the first real center in America. DeWitt Clinton had first imagined the great metropolis New York might become, then reshaped the geography of an entire continent to make it inevitable. The day the canal opened, he uttered a fateful prediction.
New York will, in course of time, become the granary of the world, the emporium of commerce, the seat of manufactures, the focus of great moneyed operations, and the concentrating point of vast capitals. Before a century, the whole island of Manhattan, covered with habitations and replenished with a dense population, will constitute one vast city.
Hamilton would have been delighted beyond belief, and of course would have taken full credit for it being part of his vision. He would have been delighted not only to see his own state and his own city take this position of preeminence, but to see that this claim he had always made, way back when America was a struggling country that many people thought would not survive a decade, that it was going to rise to be one of the great powers in the world of nations.
New Yorkers have always been anxious to control the future, to look toward the future, to try to take an opportunity and realize it and make it real. After all, the Erie Canal did not have to be built. The packet service did not have to be invented. Jews did not have to be tolerated or welcomed. But if this will somehow make the city more competitive, in a sense, make people wealthier, what I think was the genius of New York was the ability to somehow pull all these disparate people together in the common pursuit of making money, to look beyond surface or theological or ethnic or racial differences, to say that's less important, that we remain pure. What's more important is that we succeed.
Everything was now in place. With the Erie Canal, New York finished assembling the components it would need to propel itself into the future. In the years to come, the most powerful economic engine on Earth would begin to turn with astonishing speed, calling into existence as it did the most powerfully transformative culture in human history. A capitalist culture of immense wealth and continuous change and heartbreaking extremes. So creative that, in the end, it would even seek to transcend the profound contradictions at its core. But that would take more than a century. In the years following the completion of the Erie Canal, New York would surge into the future, its citizens confident they had left the chaos of nature behind. In many ways they had. And yet, in the turbulent decades to come, as tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of newcomers streamed into the growing port, New Yorkers would confront a different kind of chaos, the chaos of man, and that would prove even more difficult to tame. Between 1825 and 1860, New York City would grow as no city had ever grown before, in a whirlwind of change, as wave after wave of immigrants arrived, and layer upon layer of physical growth was laid down with astonishing speed. Even New Yorkers habituated to change would soon feel uncannily like Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, who awoke after a night's sleep to discover that 20 years had passed and that everything around him had utterly changed. Irving himself would awake one morning to find the city he had once known gone forever.
August 29th, 1847. My dear Sarah, New York, as you knew it, was a mere corner of the present huge city. And that corner is all changed, pulled to pieces, burnt down, and rebuilt. All but our little native nest in William Street, which still retains some of its old features, though those are daily altering. I can hardly realize that within my term of life, this great crowded metropolis, so full of life, bustle, noise, show, and splendor, was a quite little city of some 50 or 60,000 inhabitants. It is really now one of the most rocketing cities in the world. Washington Irving.
Visit New York online. Jump into a taxi and play a quiz game. Visit a virtual New York. And for teachers and parents, take your kids on a learning adventure through your town. PBS online at pbs.org.